Good day, everyone. So we are finished about the basic elements of corporation, and now I'll be tackling about the characteristics of the corporation. So what are the characteristics of corporation? Number one is capital acquisition. Number two, dividends. Number three, double taxation. Number four, lifespan. Number five, limited liability. Number six, ownership. Number seven, professional management. And lastly, it's separate entity. For the capital acquisition, it can be easier for a corporation to acquire debt and equity since it is not constrained by the financial resources of a few owners. A corporation can sell shares to new investors, and larger entities can issue bonds to obtain a significant amount of debt financing. Number two is dividends. So what is dividends? So dividends is a portion of a company's earnings which it returns to investors, usually a cash payment. So as a characteristics of corporation, a corporation pay its investors by issuing dividends to them. This differs from the distribution made from a partnership or sole proprietorship to pay their owners. For example, if the stockholder holds a 5% of company stock, they would be entitled to receive 5% of the dividend declared. The third characteristic is the double taxation. A corporation pays income tax on its earnings. If it also pays a dividend to its investors, the investors must pay income tax on the dividends received. This constitutes double taxation of the earnings of the corporate entity. In other words, if the corporation pays income tax on its earnings since it is a separate legal entity, if the corporation then pays out some of those remaining after-tax earnings, which is called dividends, to its stockholders, the stockholders must report the dividend as income and pay taxes on that money again. Number four is lifespan. A corporation can theoretically operate forever, outlasting its owners. Conversely, the owners may decide to terminate the corporation at any time. For example, when Mr. Henry C. of SM Corporation died last 2019, the company did not die along with him, but still continuing its business up until now. As a corporation is owned by stockholders and managed by employees, the sale of stock, the death of stockholder, or inability of an employee to function does not impact the continuous life of the corporation. Its charter may limit the corporation's life, although the corporation may continue if the charter is extended. Number five is limited liability. Any liabilities incurred by a corporation are not also transferred to its shareholders. Instead, anyone trying to enforce a liability can only pursue the corporate entity. The liability of stockholders is limited to the amount each has invested in the corporation. Personal assets of stockholders are not available to creditors or lenders seeking payment of amounts owed by the corporation. Creditors are limited to a corporate assets for satisfaction of their claims. Stockholders have limited liability, although they could lose their entire investment if a corporation goes bankrupt, but none of their personal assets would be at risk. For example, if the ABC Corporation borrowed money from a bank, the bank cannot enforce the liability to the owners or stockholders of ABC Corporation. Instead, The bank will seek payment directly to the ABC Corporation since it is a separate legal entity. Number 6 is ownership. Ownership in a corporation is based on the number of shares owned. Buying or selling these shares shifts the ownership of a corporation to a different investor. A person who buys stock in a corporation is called stockholder and receives a stock certificate indicating the number of shares the company he or she has purchased. In a public company, the stock can be easily transferred in part or total at the discretion of the stockholders. The stockholder wishing to transfer stock does not require the approval of the other stockholders to sell the stock. Similarly, a person or an entity wishing to purchase stock in a corporation does not require the approval of the corporation and its existing stockholders before purchasing the stock. Once a public corporation sells its initial offering of stock, it is not part of any subsequent transfers, except as a record keeper of share ownership. A public company that has its shares traded on an active stock exchange may have thousands or millions of owners. Privately held companies may have some restrictions on the transfer of stock. Number 7 is professional management. In many cases, the investors who own a company are not actively engaged in its management. Instead, they hire professional managers to handle the oversight of the business on their behalf. The investors vote on the board of directors who are responsible for hiring management. Often, the stockholders who have the majority of the stocks sit on the board. So mostly if the stockholders then chooses the board of directors, the board of directors will choose the chairperson of the board of the corporation, and then the list of management go on. Lastly is that corporation is considered to be an entirely separate operating and legal entity. It operates separately from its owners and has many of the rights and responsibilities of a person. It can conduct business in its own name, therefore, corporations may own property, enter into binding contracts, borrow money, sue and be sued, and pay taxes. For our activity, cite at least 2 corporations in the Philippines that's still operating up until now, following the rule of succession of the corporation. Provide a short background. That's all for today. Thank you.